My friends, who wrote the Bible? I know, what a question, right? It has exercised scholars for many generations because the origins of Scripture in terms of authorship and the situation of authorship are so mysterious. We don't have great historical evidence for it. We certainly don't have any contemporary evidence from the ancient world for it. Our first biblical texts appear what seems to be centuries after the original composition. So what happened at the origin of these books of the Old Testament, of the Hebrew Bible? Where did they come from? Let me introduce you to one theory for a very large block of the material that attempts to account for where this material might have come from. And it has a long name, a long title, but a very important one, a famous one if you are into Old Testament Hebrew Bible studies. And that long title is the Deuteronomistic History. The Deuteronomistic History. Deuteronomistic because that little istic part is kind of like meaning it's kind of Deuteronomy-ish, or Deuteronomy sets the standard of themes and language, which is then carried through a larger block of material. So the idea of the Deuteronomistic history is that Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, 1st and 2nd Samuel, and 1st and 2nd Kings are more or less a single coherent narrative with a thesis even. And I'll come back and I'll explain where that came from and who its main proponent was, and then also what its discontents have been as the theory has been received in the field of Old Testament studies. But I should back up and say, these books have traditional authors too, of course. So these scholarly theories of authorship are in fact an attempt to explain authorship and the situation of authorship beyond the tradition or around the tradition or outside of traditional views. Of course, the traditional author of Deuteronomy is Moses, the speaking actor in the book, but Deuteronomy is a site of contestation by many scholars about its authorship for all kinds of reasons that we can't get into here. But some of the other so-called former prophets, books like Joshua and Judges and Samuel and Kings, are called the former prophets because by tradition, at least by Jewish tradition, let's say, which early Christianity may more or less had adopted, called the former prophets because they were supposed to have been written by prophets. For example, you could have someone like Samuel writing a book like Judges. And of course, 1st and 2nd Samuel, the books are named after him after all. Samuel is, of course, in terms of his office, called one of the judges in the book of Samuel, besides being a prophet, so maybe he makes a good candidate for that. Jeremiah is said to be the author of 1st and 2nd Kings. And so there you have it. You have Moses, you have Samuel, and you have Jeremiah as traditional authors of this literature. Of course, this literature outside of Deuteronomy, which I'm sort of bracketing here, don't make any kind of clear claim to authorship. You could even say that Deuteronomy doesn't make a clear claim to authorship. There's a speaking voice in the book, or a character in the book, which is who is Moses, but nothing like what we would want to see as a programmatic statement of authorship, at least not by modern or contemporary standards for such things. Those who have been following this series and reading generally in the field of biblical studies and ancient literature probably know that the idea of an author is one that might be a little anachronistic. It might be applying a contemporary category back to an ancient world where a concept didn't quite apply. Nevertheless, we go on the search for authors. We want to know who the personality was, who really influenced this, who put this together in the form that we now find it. Well, the Deuteronomistic history is one such theory that gets us at least close. At least it gives us something to think with, something to work with, right? Whether or not you agree with it. And that's why I like thinking about it. The person who's become most connected with this idea of the Deuteronomistic history is a German scholar of the 20th century named Martin Noth. Martin Noth. It looks like it's pronounced Martin Noth, but it's not because he's German, so it's Martin Noth, okay, N-O-T-H. I'll provide a link down to his main book where he wrote this stuff. In German, it has some huge unwieldy title like Überlieferungsgeschichtliche Studien or something like that. In which he's going to examine these ancient traditions. And Noth had a very particular idea about this what he called the Deuteronomistic history. He thought that the Old Testament that we now received, by and large, the basic tradition, the story of creation through the end of the monarchy, really came to us in two big blocks. you have the Torah, but then you have Deuteronomy as something, I guess, of like a hinge document at the borderline of the Torah, but also as the beginning of this other thing. Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, Israel's historical epic, you could call it. This is the Deuteronomistic history. Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, right? And so Martin Noth writes in the 20th century about this. I think his book in the Deuteronomistic history came out in the 1940s, 1943, something like that. I'll provide a link to a summary that I wrote with some quotes that I can share with you. And you can click on it and read some of the quotes from the book and see all the bibliographic information. I have a book here by Martin Noth, not the book I'm talking about. Why am I showing you this? It's just the only book by Martin Noth that I happen to have on my bookshelf, okay, at the moment. Gesammelte Studien zum Alten Testament, his collected essays, I guess, on Old Testament. Whatever the case, okay, how does this Deuteronomistic history theory work for Martin Noth? A couple of its key features are as follows. He thought that it was essentially the work of a single individual. Not that that single individual just sat in a chair with a quill pen or a stylus and parchment or scrolls and just sort of wrote this from his own imagination. No, he used sources that were available to him. He made no attempt at fabrication. Martin Noth didn't think that this was a work of fiction. Neither could it be seen to be 100% literal history as we might think of that today. But the author was very interested in chronology, showing what happened before what, who came before whom, what happened when, even uses a framework of 480 years between the Exodus and the temple, comes up in 1 Kings 6, I think, and Martin Noth makes a big deal about that. He thought that, in fact, there was an organizing principle to this literature too, and that this organizing principle was a series of speeches by major characters, and those speeches are sort of used to organize this sprawling history. Those speeches occur when a major character comes out, and sort of Martin Noth thought these speeches occurred really when a character wanted to summarize things that had happened in the past, but then also look forward to the future and give a very forward-looking, prescriptive sermon, you might say, about how people should act and what the results would be if they didn't act in the right way. And you see these speeches all over the place, Martin Noth thought, punctuating this Deuteronomistic history. Like, for example, of course, you have Moses' major speeches in Deuteronomy. But then, like in the book of Joshua, you have Joshua 23. There's this big speech where Joshua summons all Israel. That phrase, all Israel, is a very Deuteronomistic phrase. It's always all Israel came, and it's like, what, are we supposed to imagine every man, woman, and child standing there and listening to this? And he gives the speech, and he tells them to obey the covenant. And these speeches tend to go like this. 1 Samuel 12, another one. This is when Samuel's about to go the way of all the earth, or at least the king has been chosen. He's not about to die yet, okay. But he gives something of a farewell address, you know. And these farewell addresses have these very stunning kind of points. Like I'm reading the end of 1 Samuel 12, this speech. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart. That's a classic Deuteronomistic stock phrase. All your heart just appears in a lot of these speeches. And so you can recognize these kinds of things across the literature. Serve the Lord faithfully with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you shall be swept away, both you and your king. Okay, so seems to be foreshadowing, looking forward to the moment when, in fact, the nation will be swept away with its king also swept away, namely in the exile of 586 BC, narrated by the time we get to the end of 2 Kings, okay? So he thought that this author, who punctuated the stories like this, who used this language of Deuteronomy, used a particular kind of language, even if he was gathering older sources, was maybe living in the mid-6th century BCE. In other words, in the wake of the disaster in which Jerusalem and temple are destroyed in our modern reckoning of years in the year 586 BC. Of course, this author didn't know he was living in the year 586. This author may have seen, as you see at really the end of 2 Kings, seen the release of Jehoiakim in the 37th year of the exile of King Jehoiakim. This Babylonian king releases him. Presumably this is some number of years. I don't remember what the year is off the top of my head, but some number of years after, and this is really where the story ends. So for Martin Noth, this author must have lived after that point, saw the release of this king, but really it's a very dismal kind of story. A dismal story indeed, and for Noth, there really wasn't a lot of hope in the future for this. Maybe the author was somebody who was still living in the land, hadn't been exiled, but was there to see the devastation of the nation. This author had a thesis, though, and this thesis is really crucial for thinking about what, in this conception, the Deuteronomistic history, Deuteronomy, Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, what it's really about, what it's trying to teach us, right? I'll read a quote here from it off camera here on a screen. This thesis, Martin Noth said, was something like this. The Deuteronomistic historian did not write his history to provide entertainment in hours of leisure or to satisfy a curiosity about national history, no, but intended it to teach the true meaning of history, of the history of Israel from the occupation to the destruction of the old order. The meaning which he discovered was that God was recognizably at work in this history, continuously meeting the accelerating moral decline with warnings and punishments, and finally, when these proved fruitless, with total annihilation. So maybe in summary, again, the thesis is something like, there was a covenant, you have been disobeying it, I am documenting every moment at which you have disobeyed it. If you continue to do this, you will be destroyed. You continue to do this, and therefore you have been destroyed. Both the northern part of the country, called Israel in the Deuteronomistic history after the split when Solomon dies, narrated in 2 Kings 17, is heavy with this Deuteronomistic language of covenant and failure, and this is what happens. And then, of course, finally in 2 Kings 25, when we have the fall and the captivity of Judah and Jerusalem. So there you have it. That's the Deuteronomistic history. That's the big idea there, okay? Now, I promised I would speak of discontents with this Deuteronomistic history. Scholars are never content to leave a good idea alone. This is the whole point of scholarship, right? It's never just perfect. It's never just meant for everyone to accept and never to question. Martin Noth indeed started maybe even revising or tinkering with his own ideas during his own lifetime, maybe seeing within that history different sources or maybe even a hint of some revisions or layers. And really this is where the discontents have come. It seems to me, and I think this is a fair characterization of the scholarship that has been written. I'll provide some sources below and you can follow this path on your own and see if you agree. But it seems like a lot of the discontent has come from scholars who have wanted to say, no, not a single individual, but rather different kinds of revisions or layers that they think they can see somehow hidden within this greater Deuteronomistic history. So, to choose just a couple of these, leaving lots out. Frank Morecross, very famous scholar, taught at Harvard University for decades in the second half of the 20th century. He had a famous essay in which he posited two very distinct, discrete editions of the Deuteronomistic history. One came, he thought, during the reign of Josiah, who reigned during the 600s BC. And really this edition was about supporting Josiah's political program and his religious reforms and so on. But then there was another revision to this done after 586 BCE, which attempts to explain for the destruction, even in light of the fact that Josiah was such a great king. How could Josiah be so great? And yet God had also decided to destroy the nation because of the actions of Manasseh, his grandfather, right? So Cross tried to make sense of this tension and say really that tension is about two editions. If you have two editions though, why not three editions, okay? So you have a kind of a three edition school. Rudolf Schmend, another German scholar, and his students really pushed this idea of three traditions or multiple traditions. Maybe you had an independent prophetic source with these prophetic stories about Samuel and Elijah and Elisha, particularly focusing on the northern part of the country in many points or specific areas. So you could have that. Major scholar Thomas Romer also has a book, I think from 2007, in which he posits at least three different strands in here. So you start to see these strands. Probably there are many scholars who proposed 4 or 5 or like 37 strands, okay? Different layers that they think they can see. In there, it almost becomes a kind of like magic trick to see these layers. And then, if you're going to have layers and strands, why not propose that there's some kind of Deuteronomistic school or circle or collection or collaborative or collective of authors? And there have been various scholars. Moshe Weinfeld, a Jewish scholar who taught, I think at the Hebrew University, was one of these people who saw some kind of school involved in this. Raymond Person, for example, a more contemporary scholar, I think has gone for the school type approach or the circles or something like that. So there are lots of ways to do this. For me, I love Martin Noth's theory. It's big, it's bold, it's hard to prove or disprove, but it's a very coherent attempt to see some kind of genius or personality behind this. And I think this is just a tension we have to ride when we want to try to do biblical scholarship. Seeing some kind of personality or genius behind some of this, which there has to have been. And yet also recognizing that our contemporary concepts of authorship, especially focusing on a single author, might be a little too modern, might be focusing too much on an individual. I get confused by these scholars who posit 37 editions or 10 editions or whatever. I don't know. I just feel kind of agnostic about it. It makes me probably a bad Hebrew Bible scholar in that I don't get all into this multiple authorship. I mean, I feel pretty sure for the Torah, for the Deuteronomistic History, even for individual books, that there are probably circles of authors, multiple authors, redactions, and additions. I have no doubt about this. I mean, I think that it's pretty clear. I would bet the farm on that. I feel way less certain, though, about trying to distinguish and delineate what those layers are. It just strikes me, with no offense to my fellow brilliant scholars out there, it just strikes me as kind of a fool's errand. It's a sort of almost like a kind of like a quasi-philosophical thought experiment, and not something based on great evidence. At that point, I'd prefer to go more into theological analysis or literary analysis or historical analysis or linguistic analysis. But this kind of source analysis and trying to discern these levels of redaction, I don't love it. Call me a sucker for big ideas. I say Martin Noth wins on this one. I'd rather read his book on this maybe than anyone else's.